It is my pleasure this morning to introduce Candi Cann, who is a scholar in religion and death. I think she goes by #DeathScholar or something like that on the social media. She teaches in the Baylor Interdisciplinary Corps, which is the best department in all of Baylor, in my opinion. Yeah. We have a couple of reps in this room. And she also knows the Episcopal Church and grew up in it. So she is kind of coming home with us this morning. So I'm going to share her screen. And let us welcome Candi.
Okay, can you guys hear me? All right. It's so nice to be here, and thank you, Dr. Toombs or Rachel. I don't know, what do you go by here? Okay, all right. I know several of you, and it's just really great to see your faces. I agreed to this week because I just got back from Korea on Saturday, and I tell you the jet lag has been nuts for me. I was like, yes, Rachel, let's do it, because I need to get up. Otherwise, I have no reason, and I will sleep all day. But anyway, it's really nice to be here. So Rachel asked me to talk a little bit about my last book, and it just came out, I think, in January with Routledge or Taylor and Francis. And this one is called Death and Religion, The Basics. And essentially, I see it as kind of a handbook for people who are working with those who are dying, working with those who are grieving, medical practitioners, chaplains, social workers, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really looking at the different religious understandings of death and dying and the afterlife around the world. But it does so through a medical culture lens. So that's kind of the approach that I've taken in this book. Mainly because while many people think that religious culture defines how we view death and dying, essentially it's really medical culture. And so those two end up intertwining. But if you live in a system that is, for example, individual payee healthcare, so the United States where we have private healthcare systems where you purchase your insurance and that insurance is dependent on you having a job, you have a very different outlook on death and dying, and the way you're billed is going to be different. And so the afterlife conceptions often are intertwined with that. Whereas if you live in the UK where you have socialized medical care and there's a lot of conversation about death and dying, mainly because the government is paying the healthcare bills and doesn't want to pay for costly intervention or costly determinants of death, you have a very different system. And so this is part of what I wanted to discuss in my book, because people don't really think about medical culture as a separate culture. They often think about the religious perspective. But I really wanted to examine death and religion through this medical culture lens. So that's what's unique about the book. I don't recommend you buy the hardback. It's way too expensive. We do have paperback copies if you want one. So I'm going to go through the different religious perspectives, but I want to really quickly talk about the definitions of death. And there are lots of different definitions of death, and many people think that death means the same thing, but actually sometimes you find that we're talking about different things. And so first I want to talk about death. And it's defined by different cultures and different medical cultures. And a lot of how we talk about death is actually shaped by the technologies that are available in those different countries. So, for example, in Pakistan, in Romania, you don't have access to the same kind of technologies that you might find in more advanced cultures. And so because of that, as a result, you also see a different definition of death. And so the traditional definition of death that we're used to, the one that's in all the movies, is cardiopulmonary death, right? So this is the one where you're checking to see if the person's heartbeat is still going. You put a mirror under their nose to see if they're still breathing. So it's based on heart and lungs. And the cardiopulmonary definition of death used to be the gold standard until about 80 years ago. And so this is the other thing. When we talk about brain death, we're talking about a relatively new definition of death. And this is a definition of death that's only been made available because of the rapid increase in technology and the access to technology and the access to money to buy these technologies. Now, as a result, though, so with the invention of medical respirators in the 1950s, it becomes possible to change the definition from cardiopulmonary death to brain death. And part of this is then sees a kind of philosophical shift in the way we approach death and how we approach dying. And so this is a new definition of death, which is adopted by most countries around the world. And we have whole brain and brainstem death. But even in brain death, different countries have adopted different versions of brain death. So in the United States, every state has adopted whole brain death as a definition of death. And this is the irreversible end of all brain activity. Now here's a catch though. Whole brain death, you have to have 2 doctors to sign off on it. And the technology to determine whole brain death is actually quite invasive and expensive. And who's paying for that? You are. This is why we use whole brain death as a medical determinator of death. In the UK and in most former colonies of the UK, we see brainstem death, which is much cheaper to determine, and it's also less expensive and less invasive. But again, this is partly because you have the government paying for these tests that determine this definition of a death. Now, the exceptions, of course, are human. So essentially, this changes the game in terms of organ donation. And for example, in Japan, they use brain death as a determinant, but only in the case of organ donation. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on there. But what's interesting is that embryos and early fetuses are the exceptions because they can quote unquote die even though they cannot satisfy whole brain death. So there's some really interesting things going on here ethically and legally, medically, if we look at issues like abortion in the United States. But I'm not going to get into that. But the point being that when we talk about death, we're not all talking about the same thing. And we need to stop talking about the category of death as though it's a universal category, because it's not. It's difficult to define, and it's culturally influenced, and it's determined by the impact of the medical care available and who's paying for that medical care. Now, some prefer to define death as the permanent loss of consciousness. Some see death as a process rather than a state, kind of like adulthood. I mean, my daughter is 16, she thinks she's 25. At 18, she'll maybe be an adult, but she still has to be 21 to drink. But if she were a boy, she'd be drafted at 18. But she can drive at 16. So adulthood is one of these fuzzy categories, right? Where we don't know exactly where people become adults. And we have all kinds of different definitions and understandings of what that is. So death is often similar. And culturally, there are some cultures around the world where death is seen as a process that takes 7 days, 2 weeks, 40 days, and maybe even a year or two. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, it's common when someone dies to leave them in your living room for a year or two. And because they are now integrated as a deceased person into the everyday fabric of daily life. People here are like, that's gross. People there are like, this is beautiful. I can care for my mother, I can care for my father. And they then become slowly reintegrated as a deceased person into life. So even death is a process. According to the World Health Organization, only a few countries, such as Pakistan and Romania, do not recognize brain death as human death. And in Japan, while the organ transplant law is enacted, brain death is acknowledged as human death only in the case of a transplant. Now, what I want to do now and bear with me, because I do have some questions for you at the end, is kind of go over some different conceptions of the way death is viewed throughout the world. Originally, this book was going to be called Death and the Afterlife, but I put my foot down. The publisher really wanted me to call it Death and the Afterlife, and I was like, it's not afterlife in every religious worldview. So some worldviews, they die and then they stop having a life. So there's no afterlife. So we did not call it that. We called it Death and Religion, the basics. But I do want to kind of go over understandings of the afterlife and how that then might impact one's view. Now, I'm not going to go into it here because this is like Sunday school and I want to keep it a little bit more lighthearted. But in the book, I talk about the intersection of disposal customs and how afterlife conceptions affect how one might be disposed of after one dies, whether you're buried, whether you're cremated, how often people visit, etc., etc. But here, I'm just going to briefly go over the different religious worldviews. So in Christianity, death is simply the separation of the soul from the body. I'm a Christian who really believes in embodied theology, so some aspects of this seem problematic to me. And there's a long history of theological writings about what happens when we die. And you know, there's a tradition in, for example, the more Catholic tradition where if your limb was amputated, it was important to keep the limb and be buried with it because you wanted to be resurrected with your entire body. So we see lots of different understandings of what that resurrection means. But essentially in Ecclesiastes, it says that there is a time to be born and a time to die. And although eternal life is a gift granted to all who accept salvation, faithful Christians then await the second coming. Now, I will say the big distinction in Christianity is in purgatory. Roman Catholics accept the notion of purgatory, whereas most Protestants reject it. And what that creates is this idea that one can intercede on behalf of the dead, but it also creates this beautiful, I think, this beautiful relationship with the dead, where you pray for and on behalf of the dead, and in return, the dead are able to help the living. They're able to bestow blessings. They're able to intercede on behalf of difficulties with God. And so there's a very different understanding, even in Christianity, on what happens once you die. And I think this distinction of purgatory is a really important one that Protestants could spend more time thinking about. The whole one and done theology I find somewhat problematic because many Protestants believe they're not allowed to grieve, and I think that's a real problem for people who feel like, oh, my grandpa went to heaven, so therefore I'm not supposed to be sad. Well, of course you're sad. This person is missing from your life. But that's a whole nother lecture on grief. The other part with Orthodox Christians, they don't officially recognize purgatory, but they do have prayers for the dead, and there's a very active liturgy that involves prayers for the dead. So this is, again, lots of, the big takeaway on this slide is there's lots of variation within Christianity itself. And I start with that to say that every religious tradition that I'm covering here, there's a huge variation within that tradition, okay? So I'm giving you the blanket statement, but just like Christianity, we see a lot of variety. In Islam, death is viewed like someone's falling asleep. It's complete with dreams, and the period between death and resurrection is supposed to be timeless. In other words, you're on God's time. And there is a final judgment, and there is a resurrection. Now, there's lots of rules in Islam that get really interesting. For example, in traditional Islam, women are not supposed to visit the cemetery. They're supposed to stand outside the gates and mourn. Weeping is traditionally looked down upon because it's seen as a challenging of God's will. You are buried facing Mecca. And then there's variation, like Christianity, on what happens in time with the judgment. Some people believe that there's a short window in which the spirits linger on earth. And Islam has a very rich cosmology of spirits and ghosts that a lot of people are not aware of. But the spirits will linger on earth, and so it's really important to pray for spirits that have recently departed. And then it's also important not to hamper that journey to the afterlife. So this is partly why weeping is discouraged, because maybe the spirits won't want to leave, right? And they won't want to go on and be with God. But life and death are believed by all Muslims to be in accord with the will of Allah, and this is why generally weeping is discouraged. Now, Hinduism believes in reincarnation, and here reincarnation is seen as changing your clothes, right? So you are here on earth to learn a lesson, and if you have not learned that lesson, then you get up and start again. And this is essentially, so it's just like, you go to sleep on Sunday, and last week was tough, but you got another week ahead of you, so you get up and you put on a new set of clothes to start the fight again. And that's what Hinduism believes. So you're reincarnated over and over until you learn the lesson. The ultimate goal, similar to Buddhism, is to be released from that endless cycle. Now, I will say, and I always tell my students this, that karma, the notion of karma, is an explanation for suffering, but it's also a justification for suffering. And so it's that double-edged sword, right, where karma explains why you suffered. So why were you born a disabled woman? I wear hearing aids, so I'm trying to present my experience. Why were you born a disabled woman? Well, maybe I didn't listen to my father in my last lifetime. So I was born with poor hearing to teach me how to listen in this lifetime. And then hopefully I learned that lesson. But it also then justifies that kind of suffering, right? So there's a sense in which it doesn't challenge systemic oppression, and that can be problematic, right? So every religion has its internal contradiction, so it's both an explanation and a justification. In Hinduism, death is a temporary cessation of physical activity, and when a person dies, some residual consciousness leaves the body through an opening in the head and goes to another world. And then it returns after spending some time there. And there's a lot of really rich literature on what's going on in between lives. And just like Christianity or Islam, we find a wide variety and descriptions of what that might look like. So let me turn to Buddhism. I was a little cut off. Sorry about that. All right, so I think the easiest way to explain reincarnation in Buddhism is the karma passes on from person to person. So it's like a bank account. All the good and evil you do is essentially you're putting deposits or taking withdrawals from your karma bank account, okay? So that bank account, while you will change lives, so I will die and then I might become a really wealthy man in my next lifetime. But I'm going to retain the Candi bank account that I had. So that transfers. The best symbolism for that transference of karma is a candle. So you light a candle, and you then light another candle. So the two candles are different substances. The flame is what passes on. Okay? So you passed on that karma, but the candles are completely different. And this is the way Buddhists believe that one is reincarnated. So that karma passes on from substance to substance, but the actual substance varies. Like Hinduism, you're here to learn your lesson. Now, Buddhism, again, has wide variations depending on where you live, but the ultimate goal of Buddhism is simply to get out of this cycle of samsara, to get out of this cycle of reincarnation, okay? So a lot of people see that as a nihilistic interpretation. They're like, oh, I'm going to cease to exist. But that's actually not what it is. I like to compare it to an empty cup. The empty cup I can fill with water, with sparkling water, with coffee. It contains a potentiality of everything. So ceasing to exist isn't ceasing to, you're not gone. Rather, you're one with all. You're one with eternity. It's really, in many ways, this beautiful, like, theoretical physics interpretation of self, right? So you die, but you become one with the eternal oneness. And so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about reaching nirvana and getting out of the cycle of samsara. But unfortunately, Westerners who are kind of discouraged with theism or organized religion, they tend to take this very nihilistic interpretation. And so Buddhism gets a bad rap in the West, I feel like. But it's actually this beautiful and rich understanding of, yes, you're no longer being reborn, but now you're with the eternal oneness. And the idea is that this is the ultimate goal, and you will continue to be reborn as long as you have karma in your bank account. So here's a trick. Buddhism has a very rich cosmology. There's lots of Buddhist heavens, there's lots of Buddhist hells. And my students will be like, well, why don't I want to be reborn in the Buddhist heaven? I teach Buddhism at Baylor. Why don't I want to be reborn in the Buddhist heaven? Well, it's easier to get to enlightenment in the Buddhist heaven. They say that the streets are paved with gold, the trees are dripping with emerald leaves, and you hear the Buddha's message from the loudspeaker wherever you go. So it becomes easier to reach enlightenment. But even the heaven is temporary. It's a temporary state. So it's nice to be reborn there. It might be easier to reach enlightenment. But essentially, it's not any different from being reborn in a Buddhist hell in that it's a temporary state and you won't always stay there. So the ultimate goal in Buddhism is to simply get out of that cycle altogether. Now then I want to talk about Sikhism. And Sikhism is actually the 6th largest religion. It's quite we don't really have many Sikhs here in the United States. They are much more populous in the UK because of the colonization of India. And of course, in India, they're the 3rd largest religion. Now, Sikhs are this really interesting mix of Hinduism and Islam. And that makes sense because they start in India, right? So they believe in the eternal God, Waheguru. And they also believe in reincarnation. So essentially, you are reborn until you reach this eternal oneness of Waheguru, and your soul will live on reincarnated time and again until you break the cycle to return to Waheguru. Now, in Sikhism, grieving is discouraged because it's supposed to be a really happy time when someone dies. Because now they've returned to the eternal God. Now, I do think that discouragement of grief, just like in Protestant Christianity, can be problematic because then people feel guilty when they're sad, or when someone says, oh, you're still not over the death of your father? Well, I mean, my mom died like 25 years ago, and I'm still not over it. And so I think we need to normalize grieving. So this is partly what the book talks about, ways in which medical practitioners, social workers, counselors, and religious people can help those who are impacted by these religious worldviews. I did want to also briefly mention indigenous traditions. I'm originally from Hawaii, and in Hawaii, it's common to actually remove the flesh from the bones for what's called a partial burial. And this allows, it's a practice it was outlawed for many years when Hawaii became a state, but just recently they're now allowing Native Hawaiians to begin this practice again, and it's utilized as a way to embrace the reality of death. Just like Sulawesi, Indonesia, where people bring the corpse into their home, it helps someone confront the realities of our bodies being only temporary, and the realities of death and decay. All right. And then, of course, I also wanted to throw in Alaska. In the book, I look at Cherokee, Alaska, and Hawaii because I really wanted to touch several different indigenous traditions. But I love the Alaskan tradition. Here, the idea is that the soul will take on the characteristics of the way they died. And I thought this was really interesting. I've seen this in Chinese religion, which I don't cover today, but it's in the book. But I haven't really seen this in many other places. So if you die in childbirth, for example, you will end up with an afterlife in the sea. Or if you die by whaling or a whaling accident, you'll end up in the sea. So here, the manner of death becomes really important to the actual afterlife you will experience. So in short, I really just want to point out that how important it is for us to talk with each other about what we believe death to be. Our definitions are completely dependent, not just on our religious and cultural context, but on the medical cultures in which we find ourselves, in which we inhabit. And also, we often mean different things. One of the things I often find is when I ask someone, what do you think heaven is? You're all Episcopalian or want to be Episcopalians. So what does heaven look like for you? What does it smell like? I think having these kind of conversations actually are very enriching, and they might bring comfort to your loved ones as they realize, oh, this is what this person believes and thinks. But also, I am always about planning what happens when you die. So what does death look like for you? In the book, I really talk about the importance of having an advance directive. An advance directive is essentially also known as a living will. It depends on where you are or what it's called. But it's essentially outlining for your family, for your doctors, what you want to happen. A lot of people believe that CPR is successful and they want to have CPR at all costs. But CPR, if you're outside of the hospital, is only effective in 13% of the cases. Without medical doctors nearby or the technology available, 13% is the success rate for CPR. But most people don't know that because we watch like all these ER shows and ER movies. I had a friend whose boyfriend died. He had a heart attack. She performed CPR on him and she was devastated because she couldn't save his life. And the reality is I had to tell her 13% of people who perform CPR have success. And a lot of people don't know that. It's also very invasive. If you're 90 and someone performs CPR on you, your ribs are going to break. It is going to hurt. You need to know that. You need to have that information, and you need to have that in an advance will, or a living will, or an advance directive. My mom, she died of a brain tumor. She had an advance will. Luckily, because my stepfather wanted to keep her on the respirator indefinitely, but she was very clear, and she had a signed advance will by the lawyer, and so I was able to tell the doctors, this is not what she wants, and we took her off the respirator. So this is really important that you guys have these conversations. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's theoretical right now, but the more you have these conversations, I can tell you, the more you're saving your family heartache and grief when that situation happens. In my mom's case, I felt relieved I was able to advocate for her on her behalf in a time of crisis. Is your state in order? If you died today, would your loved ones be cared in the way that you want? Have you discussed what you want to happen to your remains when you die? I just found out they're building a columbarium here. Apparently it's like $4,000 a niche. I was like, okay, yeah, that's doable. But figure out where you want to go. And if possible, plan ahead. It's such a huge gift when you give your family the plans that you want. And when you outline, this is the songs I want played at my funeral. This is the priest or the person. This is the readings I want read at my funeral. This is huge because then you're not leaving your family and your friends who are grieving and having a difficult time enough because you're gone to do all of this work. Do the work for them and give them that gift. It's a huge gift. And then have you discussed how you want to be remembered? Is there anything your loved ones should know? Are you going to be springing surprises on mystery airs on your loved ones? I mean, that's a hypothetical situation, but it does happen, okay? So these are some of the things that I would like you all to talk about with your table. And I know it's uncomfortable, so I thank you in advance for having the difficult conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys for a few minutes to talk about with your table.
Expensive. Yeah. Are there any questions you have for Candi? What's the definition of a soul?
Well, that's depending on which religion you're in, but I'm a professing Christian, so I tend towards the Christian version of soul. Yeah, so I'm not answering that.
Yet to be determined.
To be determined. Yeah, so I should have had, there's so many religions in here, and I didn't include them all. So Judaism is really interesting because basically there's a wide variation. Some believe in reincarnation, some actually believe in resurrection, and some believe in nothing. And my favorite quote that I like to tell everyone about Judaism is I took a group of students to a synagogue, and one of my students asked the rabbi, "What do you think about Jesus?" And he said, "We don't." And I was like, that's the answer, right? So it's very similar in terms of the afterlife. Most rabbis that I've talked to said we just simply don't think about it, which really, if you then examine the Holocaust in that viewpoint, it becomes that much more devastating because it's really lives lost. It's not this Christian kind of platitude of, oh, they're living happily somewhere else. I mean, if you look at the Holocaust from that viewpoint, you can really begin to see how devastating that was. So the answer is there's a wide variety.
Yeah, so when did cremation become more of something that you're seeing within the...
That's a great question. So there's some really interesting things about cremation. So in Asia, cremation has always been practiced. Hindu and Buddhist cultures practice cremation. In the United States, it's becoming more widely practiced. So now over half of all Americans choose cremation. But that number was very slow for a long time. I think it was partly the Catholic Church's kind of validation of cremation as a valid option. Really saw other Christian denominations accepting it. I'm a huge proponent of cremation because here in the United States, we're one of the only countries that practices embalmment. Embalmment is super invasive, it's super toxic, it's terrible for the environment. But a lot of that, I believe, is tied to our kind of afterlife conceptions and the idea that we want to imagine ourselves living in the afterlife, so therefore we stuff bodies and make them look like they're still living to comfort those who are grieving. Embalmment, though, is terrible for the environment, and it's very profitable for the funeral home industry. They will always sell you embalmment because in the United States, a lot of funeral homes don't want to hold services if there's not an embalmed body. Why? Because they move and they make noises, and that is not good for any funeral service to have a body moving or making noises, right? So all that to be said, I'm a huge fan of cremation. It's cheaper. It's much cheaper. It's also way better for the environment. It's not toxic. It's not invasive for the land. However, even in the United States, people still will choose to be embalmed first, to hold the viewing, and then to be cremated. You can go to a funeral home and ask to have a viewing without embalming. You can invite your family and friends and see the body. They will allow you to do that. So you should push for that because it's expensive, and again, it's terrible for the environment. The formaldehyde that they use to embalm bodies is awful, awful, awful for the environment. It causes cancer for the morticians. So, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was going to add, too, that I always think embalmment also has to do with the fact that we aren't comfortable with death or rotting or flesh decaying. And so it's our own way of trying to protect ourselves against death even when we're dead, which is interesting. We have one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
It's not so much a question as to, there are a few states here in the U.S. now that are doing human composting.
Yes.
I find that very freaky. I really do. You know, and I know of one state that is doing it, but it's an option, and that's the state of Vermont.
Yeah, and
I just
Washington
think
State
it's
is
very
also
weird.
doing it. It's really good for the environment. It's also fairly cost effective. It's somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000, and they just stick you in a drawer for a few months with a bunch of sawdust and some lime, and they just kind of turn you over, and then you eventually become compost so that you can nourish the ground. I think it's a beautiful way of kind of turning your body into something that gives back to the earth.
Well, like, in the funeral service, you were dust into dust.
Mm-hmm.
I may not have the word.
Yeah, dust to dust,
you're
dirt to
right.
dirt. Yep. Dust to dust, dirt to dirt, right?
Yeah, my daughter wants to stick me in the backyard. She keeps asking why she can't just stick me in the backyard. And I was like, well, there's some true crime podcasts where, it's just not really allowed. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Candi. Books are for sale. Let's thank Candi. And we will see you next week for our final session on Episcopalian Margaret Mead.